Remember those old diners back in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s? They had a jukebox. And if you sat at a booth, you might have found a jukebox player there in the booth. And you could scroll through the selections and put your coin in, and you might have heard some music like this. It's called rockabilly music. Well, that music brings back some memories from yesteryear. It's funny, back in the 50s when Elvis came on the scene and Little Richard, and, it was denounced, rock and roll was denounced as devil music, and it was going to corrupt the youth. And of course it did to a certain extent, but nothing like the music now. And it really, really took hold in the 60s with, the British invasion, and it was the use of marijuana and LSD among the youth that really created the sex, drugs, and rock and roll generation, which has simply gone on degrading and into what we see today that it passes for entertainment, which we can see how Satan operates through this gradualism. We see it in music and, of course, theater, movies. It brings up the question, are these the last days? Well, the Watchtower certainly says so, but, they're not the only ones. Just for fun, I Googled that phrase, are these the last days? And sure enough, the Watchtower appeared among the search results, an article they'd written some years ago. But they were down the list a ways. There were numerous other individuals and groups that were proclaiming that these are the last days. Some people think that we entered the last days when Jesus was on the earth, because of expressions the apostles used where they said that they were in the last days. Like in Hebrews, Paul said, God used to speak to our forefathers by means of the prophets, but in these last days he's spoken to us by means of his Son. And so they actually think that the last days, the final part of the days, began 2,000 years ago. But of course, Paul was referring to the Jewish system. It had fulfilled its purpose, and it was in its last days, and it was violently brought to an end in the year 70 when the Romans obliterated Jerusalem and killed over 1 million Jews. And that certainly was the end for that system at the time. Other people think that these are the last days because Israel became a state in 1948. Some of the more prominent evangelicals, like Pat Robertson at 700 Club, he believes that we've been in the last days since 1948. But of course, the Watchtower pretty much has a lock on Many of these individuals that say that we're in the last days are pointing forward to the return of Christ, whereas the Watchtower says Christ has already returned. He has already come, but of course, he's coming again. So they have multiple comings. There is a number of differences. For example, I don't think any of the evangelicals believe in a parousia, a presence, because most of their translations, they translate parousia as coming, whereas the New World Translation is fairly unique in all ways in translating parousia as presence. And as I've pointed out, presence is virtually interchangeable with a couple of other Greek words, epiphania and apocalypsis, which are translated in the New World Translation as manifestation and revelation. So we don't hear too many people talk about the manifestation of Jesus, and certainly not the Watchtower. They say the presence has begun, but the manifestation is something else that'll come in the future along with the revelation of Jesus. But of course, the Watchtower is unique in saying that this presence has already begun and has been ongoing since 1914. It's also interesting that some of these evangelicals that say we're in the last days, they use the same reasoning as the Watchtower in regards to what Paul wrote in 2 Timothy about men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, self-assuming, haughty, blasphemers, fierce, without love of goodness, disobedient to parents, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God, and on, unthankful, disloyal. You know the verse. Probably read it a few hundred times if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But these people use the exact same reasoning as the Watchtower because it is self-evident for anyone who's lived any number of years that people have become more and more ungodly. It's undeniable. But as I've spoken about recently, you'll forgive me if I repeat myself, won't you? I hope so. At any rate, we should take note of the fact that Paul did not say that men will become more and more ungodly during the last days. He said that people will be this way, and hence the last days will be critical times, hard to deal with, because men will be that way. And I won't elaborate on that anymore, but I would like to read an article, a very short article I'd written a couple of years ago on this question, are these the last days? So let me read that, and maybe I can expound upon it a little more. This was a commentary on the Watchtower's daily text from April the 10th, 2016. And they quote from 2 Timothy 3:1, "In the last days, critical times hard to deal with will be here." And they talk about widespread wrongdoing. And I won't read all of it, but they say, when God destroyed the violent ancient world by means of the flood of Noah's day, very few humans survived. If Noah's brothers and sisters were still alive at that time, they too died in the floodwaters. But as many women as men survived the deluge. The survivors were Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. They were preserved because they feared God and his will and did his will. The billions of humans now living descended from those 8 original humans. And okay, well, here are my thoughts from back then. Prior to the flood, Jehovah decreed that the world was going to end. In fact, God indicated the very year, saying, "My spirit will not tolerate man indefinitely because he's only flesh. Accordingly, his days will amount to 120 years. Whether the 120-year period was known by Noah or any other human is unknown. However, from God's standpoint, the world of that time entered what could be called its last days. Like now, then the world was filled with violence and immorality. Jehovah simply determined that he had had enough, and he wiped it out. We know the return of Christ will bring about a similar result. Jesus has forewarned us that his presence, parousia, will be just as the days of Noah. But did the prophetic period known variously as the last days, the time of the end, the final part of the days, and the conclusion of the system of things begin in 1914? And does it matter? Jehovah's Witnesses are convinced that the last days began in 1914, and some are even tempted to speculate that the last days of this system will also span 120 years, leading some to focus on the year 2034. There are a few things to consider, though. First, the 120-year period that concluded with the global deluge was only a fraction of the lifespan of the antediluvian generation. Prior to the flood, people lived for 800 or even more than 900 years. So, the generation that was alive when God set the 120-year limit was still in existence when Noah and his family entered the ark and the door was shut. And the subheading says, "This generation will by no means pass away." Obviously, that is not the case now. Generations have come and gone since 1914, requiring the Watchtower to more than once redefine what this generation is that Christ foretold would see all these things take place. Secondly, people did not necessarily become more ungodly during the 120-year period. They were already wicked to the core, which is why Jehovah decided to wipe them out. That is the same with the last days. Paul did not say that men will become lovers of themselves, haters of God, fierce, with no love of goodness, and all the rest during the last days. The apostle foretold that the last days will be critical times hard to deal with because men and women will have become so ungodly. Finally, if words mean anything, we should expect that the last days will be a relatively short period of time. Otherwise, why the reference to days? If 1914 was the beginning of the end, wouldn't it be more appropriate to refer to the period since then as the final years, or the concluding decades, or even the last century? Actually, the Bible does express it as a few years or days. It refers to the time Satan and his demons are ousted from heaven, to the time when they are taken out completely, as a short period of time. Furthermore, both Daniel and Revelation reveal that the period from the time the beast revives from its death blow until the end is 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 months. And it is simply not true that the beast has already arisen from the abyss to begin its successful war against the holy ones. Although there is no way of determining how long it will be from the time the world is plunged into wars, food shortages, and pestilence until the system crashes, which is when the clock starts the final countdown, given the inherent fragility of the global financial system, it could not possibly endure a prolonged period of instability without crashing and taking down the nations. The bottom line? The last days did not begin in 1914. However, all the evidence indicates Christ's coming is imminent. And I will leave it to you, the reader or listener, to ponder whether that matters or not. I remember when I first took an interest in the Bible and spiritual things, one of the first books that I came across was a book entitled The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And this was back in the early 70s. And Hal Lindsey's still at it, by the way. He is a hardened Zionist, I would say. I don't think I even read the Late Great Planet Earth. I just thumbed through it and got the gist of it. And it was just shortly after that I came across all the Watchtower's literature. And I devoured it. And I was totally convinced that Satan had been thrown out of heaven in 1914, that Christ was ruling, we're living in the last days. And yeah, I believed that up until right around the year 2000. And then it just, like, one day, I realized that there was no way that the appointed times for the nations to trample Jerusalem could have begun when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. It's totally absurd, irrational. It makes no sense. Jesus was speaking about a future trampling of Jerusalem. In a typical way, that's when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70, as I mentioned. But there is an anti-typical Jerusalem which is to be trampled. It's spoken about in the book of Revelation, the 11th chapter. It's trampled for 42 months. That Jerusalem is not the literal city because Revelation was obviously written after the literal city was destroyed. Well, the Watchtower even recognizes that. They say that the spiritual Jerusalem and the holy place was trampled back during World War I. So they've gone to great lengths to obfuscate, to twist the scriptures, the prophetic scriptures, to convince Jehovah's Witnesses that Christ came in 1914. And Christ obviously allows it for a reason. He allows this blindness and this deception to persist, this deluding influence, until he comes, until the last days begin. And that's when people will be confronted with this reality. And as I've mentioned, it'll be a test of faith. The Watchtower will have brought Jehovah's Witnesses to a certain point, and it will take them no further. In fact, it will become a misleading agent. It will become an antichrist because it will be opposed to Jesus when he authentically comes and Satan is thrown down. It seems that Jehovah's Witnesses have vastly underestimated Satan's wiles, his ability to deceive. And that's due to the Watchtower's teaching, because Jehovah's Witnesses have been inculcated with this idea that Satan is on the outside. He has the clergy and false religion, but he cannot touch Jehovah's true worshipers. We're in an insulated bubble. Well, that just ain't so. Satan had influence over Christians in the first century, didn't he? That's why Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 11. He said he was worried that as Eve was seduced, somehow the minds of Christians might be seduced by Satan. And then he went on to expose these false apostles, superfine apostles, he called them, that were within the Corinthian congregation. So why should Jehovah's Witnesses assume that there is no satanic influence? Watching the governing body's annual meeting from last year, when they spoke about the King of the North, there was another talk. The brothers were highlighting the rescue work, reconstruction work that Watchtower has done, which they're to be commended for. But they were saying that these natural disasters, storms, volcanoes, and such, were evidence that we're in the last days. It is true, Jesus foretold earthquakes, but floods, volcanoes, storms of different types, I don't think so. It's true that hurricanes are becoming stronger because of changing weather patterns, but that has nothing to do with the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, other than the fact that men are ruining the earth, right? The Watchtower also goes as far to say that Jesus foretold there will be pestilences. Well, they describe heart disease and cancer as pestilence that are this proof that we're living during the time of the fulfillment of that prophecy. But isn't a pestilence something that is rapidly contagious, like the Black Plague that devastated Europe in the 1400s, or the Spanish influenza that swept the earth in 1918 and 1919, killed millions and millions of people in a very short period of time? But cancer? People get cancer from lifestyle, and you can have it for years and years, and it's not contagious. It doesn't result in sudden death. Same with heart disease and diabetes and all these other lifestyle illnesses. It is very dishonest for the Watchtower to say that these things are fulfillment of, they even say AIDS is, But that's not to say that there cannot be another Spanish influenza. In fact, scientists have been warning about such a thing, that it could even be worse than what was experienced a century ago with the Spanish influenza. And even more unsettling is the fact that it could be a man-made biological agent that could be released by rogue elements or as part of literal direct warfare. It's weapons of mass destruction. Even though they're illegal, that doesn't stop the United States from using like phosphorus weapons. And so anyway, my point is, just because we're not in the last days now doesn't mean that the coming of Christ is a long way down the road. It simply means that everything Jehovah's Witnesses have come to believe as regards Jesus having come already and all of that will be completely discredited. But so be it. And those with faith will surmount their little difficulty, the confusion. And that's why Jehovah is going to allow it. And I say, come, Lord Jesus. Well, thanks for listening. I'm going to play some more of this decadent rockabilly and hopefully talk to you tomorrow.